Art. MTC 2-1, Unit 9. 1-3 Exercise 1. By the beginning of the 20th century, psychology as science had barricaded itself against any liaison with culture. 2-0. The focus on experimental psychology of lower psychological functions was expected to make psychology a real science. Linkages with history in general and cultural history in particular would have been obstacles on the royal road to scientific purity. The result was another century of no serious work on complex cultural phenomena by psychologists. Music, a favorite topic for early psychologists in the 19th and early 20th century, has not been a prominent research field as the discipline enters the 21st century. 1920, 21. The story is similar in the case of religion, which in its various forms frames social and personal lives all over the world. It had mostly been abandoned by psychologists as a research field by the 1920s. 1920. Nearly 100 years later, our lives are filled with ever re-emerging spiritual sentiments that are easily captured by new religious organizations. 100. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2-1, Unit 9. 1-3 Exercise 2. In addition to the difficulty we meet when defining bacterial species, their evolution is faster than that of animals and plants because they have had more time to evolve, existing so much longer. In addition, their generation times are much shorter. The fastest growing animals may produce offspring within days, whereas many bacteria can do so within hours, and some can multiply in less than 10 minutes. 10. A few mutations are likely to occur every once in a while within a population, which by themselves are evolutionarily insignificant, but eventually their accumulation drives the changes necessary to adapt to novel environments, resulting in the development of novel species. The build-up of mutations over generations occurs much faster in bacteria than it does in animals and plants. Even animals and plants living today differ from those that lived in a distant past, so early bacteria must have been quite different from those we know today. Nevertheless, this is often ignored when the bacteria that lived in past eons are considered. Lacking specific knowledge about these past inhabitants, we describe them in terminology only fit for present-day bacteria. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2-1, Unit 9. 1-3 Exercise 3. Despite the protection ants offer, aphids are not always content to stick around. When they want to leave, the next generation grows wings so that they can fly to greener pastures. This doesn't escape the notice of their guardians, and the ants end the aphids' dreams of flight by immediately biting off their transparent appendages. And as if that were not enough, the ants also use chemical means to prevent their domesticated herds from escaping. The ants exude compounds that slow the growth of the aphids' wings, and, for good measure, they also slow down the aphids. A research team from Imperial College London discovered that aphids move more slowly when they cross terrain that has previously been walked over by ants. Imperial College London. The cause for the slowdown is a chemical message left by the ants that affects the behavior of the aphids and forces them to reduce speed. The beautiful symbiotic relationship between ants and aphids turns out to be not entirely voluntary, after all. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2-1, Unit 9. 1-3 Exercise 4. Sometimes a filmmaker may purposely strive to evoke a variety of subjective interpretations by developing a film around a riddle or puzzling quality. The filmmaker attempts to suggest or mystify instead of communicating clearly, and attempts to pose moral or philosophical questions rather than provide answers. The typical reaction to such films is, "What's it all about?" This type of film communicates primarily through symbols or images, so a thorough analysis of these elements will be required for interpretation. After even the most perceptive analysis, a degree of uncertainty will remain. Such films are wide open to subjective interpretation. But the fact that subjective interpretation is required does not mean that the analysis of all film elements can be ignored. Individual interpretation should be supported by an examination of all elements. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 5.7. As a teenager, Pablo worked hard as a shoeshine boy in Piedras Negras, Mexico. Pablo Piedras Negras. Pablo always showed passion for any type of work he did, however modest. Pablo. People saw the glimmer of hope and ambition in his eye. When Pablo was about 14 years old, he met Gerald Porras, a missionary who lived near his parents. Pablo 1.4, Gerald Porras. He would often ask Pablo to run errands for him, in an effort to make a connection with Pablo and teach him English. Pablo. Pablo shared with Gerald his passion for automotive mechanics and his desire to be successful in the U.S. Pablo Gerald. But the key to success in America, he told Pablo, was to learn English. Pablo wanted to impress him, so he studied English on his own and read countless books. Pablo. The next thing he knew, Gerald was walking Pablo across the U.S. border to a high school in Eagle Pass, Texas. Gerald Eagle Pass Pablo. Crossing the border didn't entail much of a cultural difference, with the exception that the schools expected students to speak English. At this point, Pablo was in his late teens, and still wasn't proficient in English. Pablo. It was nerve-wracking, then, that his first English assignment was to write an essay. Not only was Pablo unfamiliar with the curriculum in general, but he had never written an essay before. Pablo. He remembers doing the best he could with his limited knowledge of English and turning in his essay. But he received a failing grade. Fortunately, his teacher, also a Latino, did not dismiss the struggling student. Instead, he worked with Pablo, until Pablo became proficient in English, eventually earning an A. Pablo A. Pablo was also exceptionally talented in science and math. Pablo. So, with hard work and perseverance, and a little help from his English teacher, he eventually graduated as valedictorian. Thus, Pablo learned early that in order to be successful, you must also put in the time and effort. Pablo. He gave much of the credit for his early success to the principal and teachers at his school in Eagle Pass, and especially to Gerald Porras. Eagle Pass Gerald Porras. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 8. The development of advanced brains that can transcend appetitive urges and satisfy more complex demands was motivated by significant evolutionary pressures. The unrestrained pursuit of noticeable stimuli to serve internal urges is not adaptive in a world filled with danger. In addition, the ability to postpone gratification on the basis of context is essential to the development of social groups. For example, the lowest animals in a social hierarchy must wait to eat until more dominant members of the social group are sated. To make such advanced behaviors possible, special circuits evolved to modulate the internal urges and narrow external focus that are induced by the reward system. These circuits, whose major components are located in the prefrontal cortex, promote the pursuit of reward in a manner that is consistent with contextual considerations, learned rules, and a vision of the future. Clinical work with functional brain imaging has defined both the general circuits that drive default brain function and those that support higher levels of complexity and adaptability. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 9. Consider fluctuations in the price of silver. We can suppose that all information on the external influences are contained in the past record of prices, and therefore changes in the future are determined by the past, plus stochastic noise. The noise may appear in various ways, but essentially it is constructed from a sequence of independent and statistically identical random events. The complexity stems from the possible coupling between the random variables describing the events and the past price. For example, the price may follow a random walk, but the length of the steps may vary. It can grow if the position fluctuated much in the past, but remain small if the past fluctuations were low. This way, we introduce a kind of positive feedback in the price fluctuations, leading to non-trivial consequences. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 10. A field of planted and weeded crops yields 10 to 100 times as much food measured in calories as the same area of naturally occurring plants, a benefit that would have been evident to early crop planters. It also requires more labor, however, which was provided both by the greater number of people in the community and by those people working longer hours. In contrast to the 20 hours a week hunter-gatherers spent on obtaining food, farming peoples were often in the fields from dawn to dusk, particularly during planting and harvest time, but also during the rest of the growing year because weeding was a constant task. Neolithic farmers were also less healthy than hunter-gatherers were, although crop raising gave them a more reliable food supply. Their narrower range of foodstuffs made them more vulnerable to disease and nutritional deficiencies such as anemia. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 11. When discussing medicinal herbs, the news media often quote skeptical doctors who warn that if you fool around with herbs, you're playing with fire. With herbs, they say, it's impossible to guarantee good dose control. Dose control means knowing exactly how much of the active ingredient, the chemical that exerts the healing effect, you're getting per dose. 1. To a certain extent, those skeptics are right. Drugs offer a precise amount of chemical, usually measured in milligrams. With herbs, potency can vary with the health of the individual plant, how much time the product spent in storage, and other factors. But warnings about dose control obscure a larger truth. When used as recommended by reputable herbalists, medicinal herbs are almost always less potent than their pharmaceutical counterparts. So with most herbal remedies, the risk of overdose is tiny. In fact, it's virtually non-existent, according to the latest research. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 2.1, Unit 9. 1.3 Exercise 12-14. David was a bright, popular 15-year-old boy, with excellent verbal skills, but he tended to tune out when a subject focused on visual material, especially symbols. David 1.5. He hated maths, and his teacher, Mr. Paulson, had watched his grades fall steadily over the last year. Paulson. Mr. Paulson was an enthusiastic, energetic teacher who prided himself on his ability to find a way to connect with his pupils. Paulson. He didn't enjoy the idea of an able pupil slipping away from him. Mr. Paulson met with David and asked him why he thought his grades were slipping. Paulson. David said it just didn't make any sense to him, and he was beginning to feel embarrassed because all his mates knew it all and he never got it. David. Mr. Paulson noticed that David would tune out about 5 minutes into every lesson. Paulson. 5. With important exams on the horizon, Mr. Paulson was beginning to feel hopeless. Paulson. David's parents contacted him as they were concerned and indicated they wanted his advice and a new plan for the rest of the term. David. Recalling all he knew about the social brain, Mr. Paulson had an idea. Paulson. Mr. Paulson was perfectly honest with David about how worried he was and said he was planning something he had never tried before. Paulson. He asked David if he would help him teach fractions to the Year 8 students. David 8. At first David was hesitant, fearing that he wouldn't be able to do it, but he knew he could be funny and entertaining and so he agreed cautiously. David. Mr. Paulson said he wanted David to teach fractions to his granny at home first and use as many jokes and metaphors as he liked to get his ideas across. Paulson David. That went well, and as David was keen to appear smart in front of the younger kids, he prepared well for his teaching responsibility, and it was a huge success. David surprised himself, his teacher, and his friends and absolutely nailed it. He left the lesson feeling good about himself, and of course much more confident about maths. Mr. Paulson planned to ask for David's help on future occasions, but in the meantime, David found that teaching a difficult topic like maths to others, including his granny, seemed to tap into a math superpower, and it boosted his confidence. Paulson David. He had found the secret to improving his grade in maths and a new way for his brain to grow. MTC. Good job.